This is Rachel and Brianna. They are best friends. And they are about to go on a journey.
Few moments later.
Purple profile picture. Do I follow him? We don't follow him. No.
Hi everybody, my name is Rachel, and today I'm going to be talking to you about shrooms, specifically rewiring the mind, psilocybin, and the science of healing. So we're going to go back in time a little bit to discuss the origin of psilocybin mushrooms, more specifically when they were considered to be a sacred medicine. In ancient indigenous cultures in Mexico, such as the Mazatec, the Mixtec, and the Aztec, they all used shrooms in spiritual and healing ceremonies, and they were doing it to escape from reality. They were doing it in order to connect to it a little bit better. They called it Tionanacatl, which directly translates to the flesh of the gods. And then came the 1500s, where Spanish colonizers basically showed up, saw people taking shrooms and connecting to higher powers that weren't theirs, and they got a little jealous. Missionaries even went as far to outlaw it, calling it witchcraft and devilish, and so psilocybin had to go underground for a while. People were still doing it just in secrecy. So we're actually going to fast forward to the 20th century, where Western science basically rediscovered what the indigenous healers already know. In 1957, R. Gordon Weston decides to take a trip to Oaxaca to meet with a Mazatec healer who takes him through a psilocybin experience, and he ends up loving it so much that he brought it back to the world stage. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, we have this guy, this chemist, Albert Hofmann, who accidentally absorbs a new compound, LSD, through his fingertips, and then he starts having hallucinations and pretty much has the world's first acid trip, and he decides to go for a bike ride. He literally tripped into history. By the 1960s, psychedelics were everywhere. There's even this Harvard professor, Timothy Leary, who says, turn on, tune in, and drop out. Artists, music, and anti-war activists were all of a sudden using it as a symbol of peace, freedom, and rebellion. Psychedelics weren't just drugs anymore. They were like a form of protest. As protests grew and counterculture exploded, the government kind of freaked out. Nixon's administration basically figured they can't control people, but they can control chemistry. And so in the 1970s, psilocybin and LSD were labeled as Schedule I drugs, no medical use, high abuse potential, and all research was to be shut down immediately. Cut to 2006, where Johns Hopkins reopens the door with a legal psilocybin study, and they have their first massive breakthrough in 2016. In 2020, Oregon becomes the first state to decriminalize mushrooms, and they even legalize supervised therapy. In 2022, Colorado follows Oregon by being the second state to do so. In 2023, Australia approves clinical use of mushrooms. And so, after 50 years in the dark, psilocybin is finally back in the lab.
Meanwhile, 3 minutes later.
Cut the cameras.
Right. Like it's so far away right now, right? Yeah.
So now that we're zoomed in on the brain and can actually start talking about science, I wanted to preface this section by talking a little bit about where I got most of my key findings and sources from. So most of the neuroscience behind psychedelics is actually accredited towards two main researchers, Dr. Robin Carhart Harris and Dr. Guy Goodwin. They both published the therapeutic potential of psychedelic drugs in the past, present, and future in neuropsychopharmacology in 2017. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the findings from Dr. Alan Davis and his colleagues over at Johns Hopkins when they conducted clinical trials on psilocybin-assisted therapy for major depressive disorder. So for this discussion, I'm pretty much going to be referring towards them for the most part, and so let's talk about what actually happens in the brain, both biologically and psychologically. So once psilocybin is completely digested, it's going to form into this compound called psilocin. And psilocin is going to fit perfectly into our serotonin 2A receptors, which are going to regulate our mood and perception. Think about it this way. First thing in the morning, serotonin is going to text you, hey, our mood's going to be totally stable today. Then all of a sudden, psilocin decides to send a mass text, all caps, everywhere, basically saying, nah, things are going to be completely different. As Carhart and Goodwin explained, these receptors are like ignition switches that control how the brain communicates, not how much. So we all have something in our brains called the default mode network, or the DMN, which is basically our internal narrator. When psilocybin binds to the serotonin 2A receptors, it's going to quiet down this network. The brain's overthinking headquarters, the constant loop finally slows down. Neuroscientists call this ego dissolution, but really it's just the mental version of you closing all the background tabs that were using up your battery. So normally when the DMN is running the show, your brain kind of works in cubicles. Everyone's kind of staying in their own offices, no one's really talking to each other. But when psilocybin enters and the DMN goes quiet, all these walls come closing down. All of a sudden you've got like the vision department, the emotion center, the memory circuits, all of them kind of looking at each other like, wait a minute, you work here? And Carl Harris actually calls this enhanced global connectivity, which is another way of saying neural group therapy. Different parts of the brain finally start collaborating instead of competing. That's why people describe seeing emotions or feeling memories as the first time all these mental departments are actually on the same page and interacting with each other. Basically, in short, psilocybin doesn't just add color to your thoughts, it rearranges the entire canvas. It's not escaping reality, it's rewriting how reality is processed.
Is Rachel depressed? Or is it the crippling weight of being an academic weapon? Or being the world's coolest mommy? Being 23? Becoming huge?
I'm sorry, let me just...
Influencing? So no, Rachel isn't depressed. She is the mental equivalent of 47 open tabs and 1 bar of Wi-Fi.
Now, in all humor and seriousness, depression isn't a joke. It's not just feeling tired after finals or working 2 jobs. It's when the exhaustion becomes permanent and the mind can't seem to figure out how to reboot itself. And this is exactly why psilocybin-assisted therapy is so freaking revolutionary. For the first time ever, we're not talking about numbing the pain. We're talking about retraining the brain to feel differently. It's not a pill for escape. It's a mirror for reconnecting. And this project isn't just about the substance. It's about a shift in how we understand healing itself. If science says that the brain can change, that quantifies hope in a way. If healing, it's saying that healing isn't just possible, it's measurable. So we just talked about how the brain can change and be retrained, which is exactly what Dr. Alan Davis and his colleagues at Johns Hopkins in 2021 decided to explore through their JMA psychiatry study. In this study, they treated adults with major depressive disorder using psilocybin-assisted therapy, and the results were absolutely phenomenal. After 4 weeks, 54% of these participants reported absolutely 0 depressive symptoms and that they were in complete remission. Brain imaging studies actually help explain why. We talked about this a little bit earlier on how psilocybin actually boosts crosstalk between brain networks and it quiets the DMN, which is, that overthinking loop behind self-criticism and emotional rigidity. If those results don't impress you, there's even a participant that said,
"It felt like years of therapy condensed into one day."
Here's the thing, what made the Davis study so groundbreaking wasn't just the remission rates, it was about how the brain had changed. Psilocybin didn't just shut off these depressive symptoms, it was also turning things on. It was reconnecting these neural circuits that had gone silent during depression. And this is kind of where the story shifts from treating depression to retraining the brain. As another researcher puts it into words, what makes this line of research so fascinating is that it's not about symptom relief. It's about neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to rewire and rebuild. That's actually personally what draws me into this kind of research. It's amazing to see how powerful the brain is and how we're able to rewrite our own stories. And it seems that psilocybin seems to just kind of open all these doors of all sorts of possibilities. And participants often describe seeing their lives from entirely new perspectives. It's as if like their emotional software finally updated. And Reif and his colleagues actually call this a psychological reset. It's where a state where fixed loops dissolve and new meaning can form. It's not just chemistry, it's consciousness under renovation. So yes, psilocybin can rewire your brain. That's the science. But biology isn't the whole story. Healing happens in context, and therapists like to call this set and setting. It's going to be your mindset and your environment. So Reif actually puts this as simply as the drugs open the door, but the setting decides what you find inside. And this kind of goes to saying that you want as much of a calm and guided environment as possible, just like in Davis's study where they had trained therapists. Patients need to feel secure and safe in order to really feel and report that transformation. In short, if you have a chaotic and fearful place, you're not going to really get the most positive. It's not going to be the most beneficial or positive experience for that person. It's probably just going to invoke a lot of terror.
Nightmare, 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 nightmare.
That's why modern psilocybin therapy tends to emphasize and prioritize safety, guidance, and integration. The medicine might unlock the emotion, but the setting actually shapes how you walk through it. But even in the safest setting, something else also has to happen, because healing with psilocybin isn't about controlling. It's about letting go. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the science of surrender and what that actually looks like in the brain. So what actually happens during this process? Psilocybin basically forces our brain to go from a top-down control to a bottom-up awareness. Our prefrontal cortex, or our command center, essentially kind of loosens its grip, and then our limbic system, where our emotions live, actually recalibrate. In short, psilocybin therapy isn't about escaping reality. It's about seeing it with a brain flexible enough to understand it and not have any sort of judgment behind it. So you might be asking yourself, what is that? And it's good news for you, as it is 100% an indicator that this video is going to end sometime soon. This is a BPSC lens model, which is basically a fancy word of saying it's a psychology mind map. And today we broke down psilocybin therapy into this, which we're going to go ahead and go over quickly and just review. We're going to go ahead and start off with the foundation, which is going to be the biological aspect. We've already talked about how psilocybin rewires the brain, how it binds to serotonin 2A receptors, and then it's going to flood with neural communications, which is going to quiet down that DMN, and then it's going to boost neuroplasticity. At a psychological aspect, psilocybin therapy goes beyond chemistry. It reshapes your entire perception. A lot of people go through ego dissolution, which is basically the softening of your inner critic. Once that ego is loosened and allows emotional processing, it's basically the mind learning to see itself with compassion instead of control. The compassion element is what stood out to me the most, because once the ego relaxes and there's space for understanding and not control, it honestly just reminded me a lot about when we talked about mindfulness and cognitive reframing. It's about changing how we relate to our thoughts instead of just fighting our thoughts. Socially, psilocybin therapy honestly shows how healing thrives in connection. They're not independently doing this. They're not in isolation. They're there being guided by trained therapists that are going to help integrate this experience with them. This structure of the therapeutic alliance model honestly just really reflects how the relationship is part of the treatment. On a larger scale, we can kind of see how society has slowly began a shift away from stigma to more of an understanding approach. On a personal note, I'll be honest, I was very nervous and hesitant to do this as a topic because psychedelics aren't exactly the safest academic topic to really discuss, but that's exactly why I chose it. I tend to go for a lot of taboo ideas. I've done papers on nicotine, marijuana, etc. So I took a leap because as a physician, you should always be comfortable with the uncomfortable, and that's exactly why I did it. I was kind of more worried about how it would be received, but now I honestly hope that it just gets someone else out of their own comfort zone. So now that brings us to the cultural aspect, which we already kind of talked about, how it went from an ancient sacred medicine to modern medicine. This reflects cultural relativism, which is that no single worldview owns the truth. Healing looks different across cultures, but its purpose is universal. So yeah, thank you for coming on this trip with me. I know it was quite the journey. I had a lot of fun with this one. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Kind of makes me excited for the future of mental health, especially with these new possible opportunities with rewiring our brains and exploring all possible options. And one last thing, healing isn't always linear.
Later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one. Few inches later.
Bad things in the world happening.